Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar, which is delivered jointly by the MHRA and the HRA. The focus on the webinar is on the guidance that will support the new clinical trial regulations. My name is Andrea Manfrin, and I am the Deputy Director of Clinical Investigations and Trials at the MHRA. The webinar will be recorded, and the link to the recording session will be uploaded on the Gov UK website. So we're not going to share the slides. We just wait another 10 seconds because we see the number of participants increasing, and then we're going to start, and I'm going to go through the agenda. Excellent. So this webinar is divided mainly in two parts. The first part is going through the session on each topic of the guidance that we're going to cover during this webinar. And the second part of the webinar will be a Q&A session. And you will have the opportunity to provide your question, and then we're going to answer your question as well. So in session one, we're going to focus on the application of clinical trial approval. And this session will be led by my colleague, Krina. Krina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Krina Kaku, and I'm leading the operations team within the clinical investigations and trials at the MHRA.
Thank you very much, Krina. And then Sarah.
Thanks, Andrea. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Gendron, and I'm a policy specialist in Krina's unit at the MHRA.
Thank you, Sarah. And then Anthony.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anthony. I'm a low-risk assessor manager, covering sort of all things within the low-risk and notifiable trial section of the MHRA.
Thank you, Anthony. And Anthony will be leading also session number 2 that will be focusing on the approval of the modification for clinical trial. Just to remind yourself, we're going to use the word modification in the new clinical trial regulation instead of amendment. Session number 3 will be focusing on the safety issue, and here we will have Maria. Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, all. My name is Maria Urdaneta. I'm a senior medical assessor and the head of medical assessment. Today, I will cover safety reporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. The next session, session number 4, is focusing on the end of a clinical trial and transitional arrangements. And we have Stephen. Would you like to introduce yourself, Stephen?
Thanks, Andrea. Afternoon, all. My name is Stephen Lamb. I'm the business manager within the Clinical Investigation Trials Operations team.
Thank you, Stephen. The next session is transparency requirement and plans for HRA guidance. And we have with us Chris.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Cole. I work with the HRA and the guidance manager, and I've had a role in the development of the HRA guidance.
Thank you so much, Chris. And last but not least, we're going to summarize everything, and the summary will be provided by Kingin. Kingin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kingin Lee. I'm the head of clinical trials at the MHRA.
Thank you, Kingin. So without further ado, we're going to go into the next session, and we're going to open the overview. Thank you. So this is just a summary of the clinical trial regulation roadmap that we went through during the last year or so. We divided this in 3 steps: the parliamentary process, the development of the draft of the guidance, and the last part is the finalized of the guidance. So during the 2024, we work on the development of the clinical trial regulation that were laid before Parliament in December, on the 12th of December. And in parallel, we were drafting the new clinical trial guidance to support the clinical trial regulation. We have engagement with our stakeholder, and now we are going to share the feedback that you kindly provided to us. This will enable us to finalize the guidance that will be published around the springtime. During this period, we're going to receive other comments from you, and therefore we finalize the guidance that will be published around August 2025. The guidance will become live around the beginning of 2026. Next slide, please. So what we're going to cover today. The first point is the application for clinical trial approval, including the notification, which is a new approach that we are introducing to the new clinical trial guidance. The second part is applying for approval to modify clinical trials. I remind you that the modification is the new way to call amendments. Then we're going to cover the safety reporting, the end of a clinical trial, transitional arrangement, and transparency requirements and HRA guidance. Further guidance will be on labeling requirements, non-IMP, good clinical practice, and they will be provided by the MHRA in due course. Next slide, please. And now over to Krina for the application of clinical trial approval.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello again, and thank you very much for your insightful comments on the draft guidance. It might be helpful to clarify a couple of points before we address the specific themes that you have raised. The guidance is about processes and any changes resulting from the new clinical trials regulations. It relates only to the MHRA's remit on clinical trials. HRA guidance will address ethics-related matters. Further UK-specific guidance on safety aspects that remain unchanged under the new clinical trial regulations is underway. I will now pass it to Sarah for thematic feedback on applying for a clinical trial approval. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Karina. So I'll be talking through some of the feedback on the section of the draft guidance about applying for clinical trial approval. The first theme to touch on is about the timelines that are included. So we had some queries about timelines that weren't specified in the guidance. So as an example, if the sponsor asks for more time to submit their response to a request for further information, which is a grounds for non-acceptance under the current regulations, how long would it take for the authorities to respond to that request? So for these, if there's no timeline in the guidance, that means that it's not in the legislation. We generally won't be providing more detail on these in the guidance because they could vary quite a bit depending on the circumstances of the particular case. But we can say that obviously we do understand the importance to applicants of an efficient approvals process. So we will aim to respond as quickly as we can. We then also had some requests to make the timelines and the diagrams clearer. So we'll be reworking all the diagrams into a timeline format with the day of submission as day 0 and then progressing from there. Then moving on from timelines, the next topic is about trials that aren't submitted through combined review. While the new regulations establish a legislative basis for the combined review process, they do also include a provision that allows sponsors to ask for permission from the authorities to submit separate applications for clinical trial approval, so one to MHRA and then one to the Ethics Committee. We had quite a few comments asking us to explain the circumstances in which the MHRA would agree to those requests. The regulations do provide some guidance here, although it is quite high level. So it states that separate applications would be for an urgent situation where it would be beneficial to progress one request or application while preparing the other. We'll be leaving it up to the applicant's judgment as to whether this applies, and we don't intend to add detail into the guidance on this. However, our general principle is that we would only agree these requests in very exceptional circumstances. So in the vast majority of cases, we would expect combined review to be used. And then in terms of processes for this, if a request is agreed to make separate applications, we'll provide more information on how those applications should be submitted at that point, although we can say that the timelines will be identical to those for combined review submissions. And then, of course, there are trials that were approved prior to the implementation of combined review, which means that for those trials, if the sponsor wants to submit a modification, which, as Andrea said, is the new term for an amendment in the new legislation, that can't be submitted to the MHRA via IRAS. So we will be updating the guidance on modifications to make sure that it's really clear what the processes for submitting those modifications are. And again, the timelines for those processes will be the same as for combined review trials. And then finally, for this section, there were a number of comments relating to the documents that need to be submitted with an application. So as Karina mentioned, the guidance that we shared is MHRA guidance, and HRA will be producing their own guidance to cover specifics that relate to the Ethics Committee review. So to avoid confusion, we'll be removing from this guidance references to any documentation that's reviewed only by the ethics committee, so things like the chief investigator's CV, and will instead link to the relevant HRA guidance. But just for clarity, the new regulations don't change which authority reviews the various documents submitted as part of the application dossier. And then lastly, on this section, it was noted by quite a few people that the guidance didn't state that the IMP dossier can cross-reference the investigator's brochure or other standalone documents like the qualified person declaration. So this cross-referencing is absolutely allowed, and the guidance will be updated to make that clear. So that's it for the applying for clinical trial approval guidance. So I will hand over to Anthony to talk about notifiable trials.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So as my colleagues already sort of explained, everything that she's detailed that applies to applying for a clinical trial will also apply for notifiable trials. But there's also some specific points that were raised in the feedback from the guidance. So I'm just going to address some of the key ones that came up multiple times now. So first of all is the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So there was some confusion about these, are quite difficult to understand because they were covering multiple options in the same table. So we're going to update the tables for clarity. We're also going to make it really clear that for a trial to be eligible for a notifiable trial, it just has to meet one of the inclusion criteria and none of the exclusion criteria. It doesn't have to meet multiple inclusion criteria as long as it meets one of them. This should make it really easy for people to determine if your trial is eligible for notification. The criteria and some examples are quite well explained now. We're also going to provide some more information about what happens when we would object to a notifiable trial and how this works. So in principle, when we object to a notifiable trial, it will just be sent for regular full assessment. And this won't reset any timelines. The clock will count from when validation was passed, and it won't go back just because it's been sent for full assessment, so it won't actually add too much time to the application. And we also want to make it clear that if we do decide that it needs to be fully assessed, the sponsor can withdraw their application before the assessment occurs without any fee. At this point, you could just choose to withdraw before the full assessment occurs. We think that this will make it a lot clearer for sponsors to see what can happen in the event that the trial is not notifiable. There was also some confusion in the guidance about our use of the word non-mandatory information. So we're going to clarify in the guidance, but just to clarify now, it's non-mandatory information in the fact that it's not required for every submission type, so it is not mandatory. However, the non-mandatory information will be evidence for certain criteria you may be relying on. For example, if you're relying on your trial already being approved elsewhere, then the non-mandatory information would become mandatory as evidence that your trial is approved elsewhere. So this will need to be required. This will need to be provided at the submission point rather than during the assessment. So these will become mandatory at the submission point for certain trials. This will avoid any delays and make it really easy for us to approve the trials quickly. If we can go to the next slide. So now I'm just going to quickly talk about modifications of a clinical trial. As Andrea said, this is our new word for amendments. So this is going to cover sort of all aspects of modification of a clinical trial. However, it will focus on the Route B modifications because this is where most of the questions came up. So we received really great feedback on this section. It was really helpful for us to see where the confusion lies and how we can improve. So again, I'm going to highlight some of the things that came up multiple times. So first of all, we have the criteria table for Route B modifications, Route A modifications. We're going to separate these into two tables. Rather than have one table with a list of all the possible things, we're just going to have a criteria table for Route B and for Route A. The Route B criteria table will be a completely exhaustive list. You look down that list. If your criteria is in that list, it's eligible. There will be nothing that's not in that table. However, for Route A, these are going to be some examples because effectively everything that isn't Route B would be Route A, but we will put some examples to show to help guide you on what to do. We're also working with MHRA, and when the modification tool is updated, this will also provide clarity and signpost you to the correct submission type. So in addition to the clarification on the tables, we're actually going to include a decision tree, a sort of flow chart, and this will help you identify the most appropriate submission. So the flow chart will go down. First of all, is it a substantial modification? And then is it Route A or Route B? Is it a modification important detail? And we're going to, hopefully this will make it really clear and really easy for sponsors to identify what they would like to submit. As with the notifiable trials, just the non-mandatory information is not mandatory because it's not mandatory for every application, but if you are relying on that evidence, then it will become mandatory for your submission. We're going to update the text to make this really clear. And again, the non-mandatory information will just be sort of evidence of the criteria you're relying on, sort of in addition to what you would normally provide anyway for an application. The final point that I want to raise is what happens with invalidation for Route A and Route B modifications. So if we receive a Route B modification and we determine that it's ineligible and was mistakenly, or we decide it needs to be sent for full assessment, this will go down the Route A process. There'll be, again, no extension of timeline. This will just continue on from the validation point. Unfortunately, we can't do that for Route A submission. So if a Route A submission was submitted and it should have been a Route B submission, we won't have all of the necessary information and the non-mandatory documentation to actually make that switch, so it would have to be invalidated. However, we really don't see this happening very often. We think this is a very unlikely event. The guidance will be very clear with the flowchart, with the tables, and we think it should be very easy for sponsors to determine the correct route of submission for their modification. So I'm now going to hand over to Maria, who's going to talk you through the safety reporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. We have received very useful feedback on safety reporting, which we have reviewed in detail and considered all. In this slide, you can see the main points identifying the feedback we receive, including the details of our actions. The first point relates to SUSAR reporting. A clarification was requested on reporting of placebo-related events, so we will add a specific guidance on this aspect in the final document. The next 3 points refer to the SURs. First, we had a request of adding references to ICH E2F. So in the final guidance, it will be clear that the SUR should align with the ICH guidance. We were asked to add more DSUR example scenarios, as only 2 examples are currently included of different DSUR. So we will add examples to cover non-commercial and other common scenarios. We had some requests for further clarification in the DSUR submission process, so we are adding more details to make it all very clear. Regarding urgent safety measures, there is a request on clarification to the process. We would add clear details on how to notify a USM. In particular, we are going to add a helpline telephone number, and it will be clear that phone notification should be performed within 24 hours, but this can happen up to 3 days following the measures being taken. So all this will be very clear and the process will be detailed. Finally, it was requested to add guidance on reporting of serious breaches. Therefore, a small section on serious breach process will be added in the final document. Thank you. Now I will, my colleague Steven will provide an update on end of clinical trials.
Thank you, Miriam. Afternoon all, and thank you for all the feedback that we've had to the guidance to date. In this section, I'll be covering aspects related to the temporary halts, the lapsing of the trial approvals, and also the deferrals of the publication of results. Now, in relation to temporary halts, and again, thank you for the feedback we've had. In the updated guidance, we will look to include a section on temporary halts that will cover the suspension of trials for safety reasons rather than logistical reasons. For example, pausing of the enrollment for reasons where there is no impact on the subject's safety. We will also include what the definition is of a temporary halt. Within the table of modifications that can be found on page 30 and 31 of the guidance, we will also look to include so within the table of modifications, also include the reasons for the temporary halts within it, as these should be submitted and notified to the MHRA. In addition, we will also clarify that the trial cannot restart until the substantial modification to restart the trial has been approved by the MHRA and the Ethics Committee. We will also include a diagram to explain the temporary halts and the submissions for these. As per the current process and legislation, there will be no change as to when you need to inform us of the temporary halt, and that will still stay the same at 15 days. With regards to the lapsing of trials, the approval will lapse 2 years from the date on which the trial was approved if no participants have been recruited in the UK to take part. So again, just to emphasize that this is the recruitment in the UK trial, not the global recruitment if it's a multinational trial. With regards to the results and the publication, further guidance will be provided by the HRA with regards to deferral and the transparency requirements, which will also include information for phase 1 specific trials. Next slide, please. On the transitional arrangements, again, thank you for the feedback. We've had a few questions and clarification was asked regarding the old rules clinical trials versus the new rules clinical trials. Clarification on the non-combined review trials and the transitional, and then also for the labeling. So we will look to, in the future guidance, to reword references to trials submitted under the old rules and those submitted under the new rules. So we'll avoid any confusion there as well to make it clear. In terms of the process, so again, there was a bit of confusion about the processes as to which should be followed. For trials that have either been assessed or migrated into combined review versus those that are still ongoing under the non-combined review process. The guidance to date does cover both aspects. However, we will make clear in the guidance if there is slightly different processes with regards to submissions for the trials that have either gone through combined review or non-combined review. All new amendments, regardless of whether they're related to combined or non-combined review, they will still need to go through the new rules if they were submitted on or after the date when the regulations are coming into force. With regards to the labeling aspect, any IMPs that were manufactured before the new regulations come into force, they can still be labeled according to the old rules. However, any IMPs manufactured on or after the new regulations have come into force, they must be labeled according to the new rules. And again, we will make clear of this within the new guidance. Next slide, please. And I will now hand over to my colleague at the HRA, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Hello again, everyone. My name is Chris Cole. I'm a guidance manager, and I'm just here today to discuss to you a bit about the HRA guidance and what we've been working on. So for context, whilst the MHRA has been working on its guidance, the HRA has also been working together on pulling together a piece of guidance that is going to communicate what's changing with the CT regs on our own. We've developed this in collaboration with the MHRA to make sure that we're kind of staying consistent with them, and also that we're working to the same timescale so that once the MHRA publishes their guidance, the HRAs will also go out as well to complement each other. We've also been working with internal subject matter experts who've been involved with the project for a long time to ensure that everything we're communicating is as accurate as possible and fully captures everything that you need to know when the CT regs eventually comes out and goes into force. So, as kind of been mentioned throughout the talk today, the HRA guidance, it will cover some aspects that the MHRA guidance covers as well. So, for example, the approvals timelines. However, we'll also be going into some areas which is more within our own remit. So this includes, for example, the Research Ethics Committee's constitution and membership and how that will be changing after the CT regs. In addition to that, we're also going to have some guidance covering the transparency requirements. So this is, for example, the requirements that are being brought in with the CT regs regarding registration of trials, publishing summary results, and sharing results with participants and any other relevant persons. Our guidance will also capture the deferrals process, including some details regarding deferrals in phase 1 trials, and in more exceptional circumstances, waivers and how you can apply for them. Today, we're very much focusing on the guidance that we've developed, but we're also happy to field any sort of questions that people have regarding that kind of transparency requirements that have been brought in the CT regs. So we've been working on this guidance for quite some time now. The plan will be that when we will be publishing it on the HRA website, and it is written very much with the intent that it will walk all of our stakeholders through what will be changing when the CT regs comes into force. So everyone can have a clear understanding about how current processes will change and can prepare around that, given that the time that we have until the regulations come into force. Now, we've also, in collaboration with the MHRA, they've very kindly been kind of communicating with us about their experience with engaging with you all and sharing their guidance and the feedback that we've received. So we can look at areas where we have similar approaches in terms of, or similar topics rather, being covered, and we can factor in how we can address the kind of feedback that you've given and make sure that ours kind of more effectively communicates the message that we want to put out in April when it is published. So currently, we're approaching the end of having a finalised draft of our guidance. The intent is that around mid-March, we'll be putting out to stakeholders in order to get, similar to as the MHRA has done, some feedback so that we can identify areas that perhaps need more clarification or just how we can tweak our approach to make it as impactful as possible. And then again, as mentioned earlier, the intent will be that we'll be publishing our guidance in sync with the MHRA guidance as a kind of unified message. In addition to this, similar to the MHRA, the intent will be it'll be getting published in April, and then throughout the year we will be receiving and also encouraging all stakeholders to provide any feedback they have on the guidance we put out there, so that later on in the year we can come back to it, revisit, and potentially look at how we can enhance it further. For example, trying to address any sort of questions that are commonly occurring within the wider research community. And because of this, we're planning around the stakeholder engagement that's going to happen in March. And as you'll see here, we have an email address that we are encouraging anyone who's interested in being involved in looking at the guidance and giving us a feedback to get in contact with our engagement team. That's engagement.team@mhra.nhs.uk. And again, this slides will be circulated afterwards, so you'll be able to see that. But if you are interested in all being reviewing our HRA guidance and giving us some feedback, please do just drop the email to the engagement team, and we'll keep everyone updated in terms of when it's going to be going out and kind of how the feedback will work. And I believe that is everything from me, and I'm handing back to Andrea, I believe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I think that Kingin will now summarize everything before going to the next session, which is the Q&A. Kingin, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. So we realized there's some new stakeholders onto this meeting. So what I would be doing is summarizing the presentation with the new clinical guide, so new clinical trial regulations. So this will recap over the high-level changes intended to encourage clinical research and innovations of medicines in the UK. There are 5 important areas of change from applying to a clinical trial, modifying an approval, safety reporting, and ending a trial, and transparency. Applications and modifications to clinical trials will be more sponsor-driven, thus becoming more agile and more flexible when needed by the applicant. Safety reporting will incorporate more flexibility while removing burdens such as duplications. There will also be a clear timeline for ending trials that do not recruit participants. And finally, in transparency, it will be mandated through trial registration to a public registry and offering a summary of clear and understandable results to participants. Thank you. I'll pass back to Andrea.
So if I can have probably the last slide for the closing and the next step. So the next step for the clinical trial regulation, we are now waiting for approval, as I mentioned before, from the SI from the Northern Ireland, and then we will have a 12-month implementation period. The next step for us is that we're going to update the guidance based on the feedback, and we're going to publish then on the gov.uk during the springtime. Then you will have an opportunity to provide more input at that stage to finalize the guidance. And the final version of the guidance will be available during the summer. With this slide, we just come to an end of our webinar. I would like to thank you, all the stakeholders, for their engagement, their recommendation, feedback, comments on the guidance, and a huge thank to all my colleagues from the MHRA and the HRA for their participation and clarity during this webinar. Thank you so much, and I wish you a great afternoon. Thank you.